with me today. We're going to launch Women's History Month, which has nothing to do with our topic, but it might for you. And we are going to launch the first live stream that goes with the first podcast of the season 4 of the Bold Business Podcast. We're here to have conversations about how do we increase our own capacity? How do we increase ourselves? How do we increase our teams, our companies, all of the above? This program is about the skills we need to lead a resilient business and to be a resilient individual as well. Today, we're talking about questions. And the question that we're going to be talking about involves empowerment. How we empower ourselves to ask better questions is the key. You're going to hear from Elizabeth and Mickey in just a little while about that. Now, I want to tell you, I'll start here. I'm the host. You already heard it's all about the Bold Business Podcast, so you know that's going to be part of what I say. And I'm Jess Dewell. I'm a strategic business advisor. We provide unique and customizable frameworks designed for leadership and management teams to fail faster and bounce higher. Companies that work closely with Red Direction learn to ask the right questions and think effectively on their feet. Okay, in this moment, I am ready to just have Elizabeth and Mickey introduce themselves. I get to introduce them the whole rest of the month. All right, Elizabeth, take it away.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much, Jess. This is really cool. I love following you, and I love really honored to be on your podcast and having you as a guest on my podcast, Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman. I was 30 years an international opera director and have now leveraged what I learned from working with Luciano Pavarotti and Placido Domingo to help high-level women in tech and law who have a seat at the table, but still aren't being listened to. So what I really work with is how to help people use presentation skills to be heard, to make an impact, and to really be strategic about it. So my podcast is Strategic Speakers Who Get Results, and we'll be featuring Jess in a couple of weeks.
And I'm Mickey Desai. I am the founder of the nonprofit Snapshot, which is a micro assessment of a nonprofit's management practices. I also produce a podcast called the Nonprofit Snapcast. And in fact, I'm trying to talk to Jess about becoming a guest on the show at some point. And now that I know that Elizabeth does a podcast, we may have a few other things to be talking about before this day is over. But I do nonprofit management and a number of other things, along with podcast production and editing for some folks. But yeah, check out nonprofitsnapcast.org. I'll look forward to everybody's feedback.
And Mickey, I just have to say that I ran a nonprofit for 11 years. So
disaster.
That's okay. She'll come right back and we know what to do. No big deal at all. So we're going to just talk for a minute, Mickey, because I don't want to steal the thunder and start answering questions if she can't hear what you say.
I think that's fair. Yes, absolutely.
Is that good? Oh, look.
Yeah.
And ta-da!
Yay! Welcome back. Technology.
We're back.
You know, I'll tell you what. I don't know what it is about yesterday and today. For every one click that you would typically take, I've needed to take 10. It is no lie about everything. So we're just going to go with it.
Goes to the machine. That's what happens.
That's exactly right. All right. So I'm going to do a shout out back to Laura. Thanks for being here, Laura. I'm glad you stopped by and said hi. And then, all right, here, we're going to jump right into this question.
Okay.
Each of you will have 2 uninterrupted minutes to answer this question. And then we're going to take the things that you say and we're going to chat about them after. And our question, Elizabeth, how about if you answer this one first?
Okay.
How do you empower yourself to ask better questions?
Well, a lot of what I do is like when I work with my clients is to help them ask questions and act as a sounding board, especially to go below the surface. What's past the easier answer? And what I'm finding is that then I have to enroll allies of my own who push me to go past the easy answer. Because it's, it's really easy to just, you pop off and you say, oh, I do this, I do that. And then somebody says, why? Why did you do that? And this is where the allies are so incredibly helpful. And I also invest a lot of money in my own trainers who push me to ask easy questions, rather harder questions.
Awesome. All right. Thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth. Did you have more to say? There was a pause there.
Yeah. And the other thing is, when I'm working with people and I'm asking questions, a lot of my work is helping people put themselves in the shoes of their listeners. Who are you presenting to and what do they care about? And then part 2 is you have to check in afterwards and say, now, what did you hear? Here's what I think I know what I think I said. What did you hear from this? Just in case some of my assumptions or their assumptions are not quite the assumptions that the listener has. And so it's constantly questions to ask questions.
Which is great. We get to go, we'll delve into that more, I'm sure. I'm going to do a quick shout out. Benita, so glad you stopped by and said hi. Thanks for being here today. Mickey, how do you empower yourself to ask better questions?
My first snarky answer was going to be, I just give myself permission to be a wrecking ball to just go through anybody's front door. I'm not sure that that's fair or even real. The ability to ask questions is something that I think some of us have more trouble with than others. And it was my own background in counseling psychology that helped me understand that not everyone can just have that facility of being able to go up and ask questions. There's a lot of insecurities that might hold somebody back. There are any number of variables that might prevent someone from asking the questions that need to get asked. But in the end, I think is just a pure realization that if you need information, you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't get it. And that is, to me, that's the basis for where the questioning process starts. Don't do yourself a disservice. Get the information you need.
Okay, now I got to ask you both.
Mm-hmm.
What's a time you didn't ask a question and wished you did? Can you share a story about that?
Go ahead, Mickey. I have so many. I have to figure out which ones.
Yeah, I don't know if the ones I can tell you are fit to print. That's the hard part. It's
right. I know.
Yeah. One more time, Jess. What was the actual? How did you frame the question?
How did I frame the question? What's a time that you didn't ask a question and you really should have, or wished you did later? I'll start while you're thinking, if you like. I didn't know this question was going to come up, but something popped into my head. One time when I was and by the way, there's still variants of this that happen over time. So I'm going to totally throw myself under the bus and say, this is one of those things I'm still learning. And in that is the fact that sometimes I need a better internal head, heart, gut connection to know when do I ask a question to further finding the answer and when it is better to have the answer. Because if somebody's coming to me and they're expecting certainty and I don't understand it and I ask questions, I make them more uncertain as a leader. However, if I come to them and and we really have something to figure out, but they're like trying to shortcut to the front of the line or get to A to B faster or something like that, that's the time when I have found that questioning actually helps the process and improves the way we do our work together and the way we get to the end goal. And it's always better with those questions. So I'm always figuring out, how do I find that? And so I was going to share a specific example and it got lost in my explanation. So that's where I'll stop.
I have a memory that I'll share. And it was while I was still an undergrad taking an organic chemistry class where we had this lab that was incredibly complex. And somehow the rest of the class was looking at me as I did my work. I don't know how I got the reputation for being the guy who gets everything right, because that was never the case. But somehow the entire lab was like, okay, Mickey's doing it this way, let's do it that way. And I should have simply asked the professor at one point, is this correct? Am I doing this thing correctly with this setup? We were doing a fractioning thing or something. And and I had completely screwed up the actual physical setup for how to run this really complex reaction. And and everyone else in the class is looking at me and sort of copying off my work. And the professor's just sitting there watching it all happen until he later says, okay, what Mickey has done is not this fractioning kind of experiment. He's actually doing a distilling experiment, and we're all going to be here till tomorrow if I let it continue. And everyone in the class is like, oh, and at that point, I'm like, yeah, I probably should have asked for some guidance early on. So anyway, for what it's worth, that's my example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Well, that makes me think about times where I should have asked questions, but I didn't want to look weak. One of the things as a woman in business, especially as a female leader, is to ask a question without starting it by saying, "Now, I'm not sure if this is worth asking, but I do have a question here." Being confident, walking the tightrope between being confident to ask a question because you see the group heading down a path that you think is going to be a problem, and yet as women, as girls, we are trained to not be pushy. So you can't be too bold, you can't be too bossy. And so quite often the habit is, I don't know if this is worth asking, but, and this is walking this tightrope is something that made a big difference to me when I was running a small opera company. And there were things which I thought I understood. It was also in Austria. So there were things about how the funding system in Austria worked that I didn't totally understand, and then would put my foot in my mouth because I was operating from what I knew about American nonprofits, which was not the same as the Austrian nonprofits. So many painful lessons later. I'm still working on that one.
Whew. I'm going to do a quick shout out to Liz Albert. She has stopped by and says, hey, so glad you're here. All right. And okay, so I was listening to the stories and I was thinking about my story, and what comes up for me, and this thing that I like to explore because I'm always asking questions and I'm always looking for that, was something that Elizabeth said about get past the easy answer. And what does that mean? And what does that actually sound and look like in practice would be something that I'm curious about. Elizabeth, we lost your sound.
Let's see. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I could certainly comment on that. Is I know I tend to make snap decisions and I tend to make snap judgments. When I'm being conscious of that, I try to get my team especially to ask me questions. I will say, well, we're going to work on this, da, 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 da. And I have asked them to say, what did you mean by this? So one of my sisters is a journalist and she's always on my case about this and that. Be specific, say the specific word. And so I ask people, check me. If I'm expecting you to read my mind, and that's not fair. So if I'm not clear, just ask me. It's fine. I'm happy to be stopped as I careen down the path. I'm happy to be told that wasn't clear. Just ask. Empowering my team to ask me questions, and my clients to say, what did you mean by that? So that I know where I'm making assumptions and where am I assuming something that may not be the case just because it triggered an idea.
Right. And in a counseling circumstance, I would say that I've heard something very similar where In interpersonal communications, the clarification could be something as simple as, what did you just hear me say? Which sounds kind of confrontational, but really isn't. If both people are on board with just getting the information leveled, what did you hear me say is just a validation of what communication has just transpired. So.
Actually, just in addition to that is one of the things I run into, because I work with women in tech and women in law, quite often there's jargon involved, or there's a word. And I have learned, working with my clients, there's often a word that I don't know, or there's a word that means one thing to me and something else to them. And so what I will often do is say, and before we go further, I know the word assessment in my world. In your world, what does assessment mean? And so that they can say, oh yeah, well, that involves this and this and this and this and this and this. There's all sorts of layers. Or I will show something to somebody and say, I think I'm only seeing the surface. What's behind that? What are the implications of these numbers that you see that I'm not going to see? And learning to be okay with saying, I don't know, in my world, this is one thing. In your world, I don't know what it means in your world. Tell me.
I hear you. And I'm going to share this one again too. Isn't this an interesting comment from Benita? I think at times that maybe we shouldn't ask the questions and rather follow our gut. This from someone who needs to learn to ask questions better. And that I'm laughing on many levels, because we do need to check in with our guts. I'm wondering then, and here's something that I do is like, well, here's the first question. And I have a variation of this. We're going to stick with it for the theme of this is, well, does that only get me to the easy answer? Let me check in and let me find out. And if it's, oh, that's only the easy answer, then I get to actually use that feedback to figure out how can I get to the better answer, or the conversation that's going to move forward to find us the path where we want to be going.
I have something of a reaction to that, if I can interject real quick.
Always.
Yeah, I think that it's a situation specific thing. There are times when I would absolutely advise anyone to trust their instincts and pay attention to what their gut says. And then there are times when I think it makes sense to sit back and question and or validate what your instincts are telling you. If you're walking down the street, or if you're coming away from something like a major sporting event and your gut says, get to your car and lock the door, you should probably do that and not question it. If you're in a board meeting and you're discussing finances and your gut says that you're fine, but the treasurer next to you says, we may be having some trouble, you may want to question what your gut's telling you. So
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking about that. And I'm practicing silence. And that was a teaser for everybody. Notice we're in the motion. We're live. We think we have expectations.
That's great.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I just want to do a quick interjection that says, don't forget, this is a live stream of the Bold Business Podcast, and we're talking about how we empower ourselves to ask better questions. And so I'm curious. I'm curious about a lot of things. Everybody who knows me knows this. And I like to ask a lot of questions. And sometimes I answer questions with questions, which when somebody does that to me, I find incredibly irritating. At first, I'm like, what is the purpose of this question of the question? And where I wanted to go with this is, well, so what skill do we need to bring this to the table? Or maybe not what skill we need to bring. What do you rely on to ensure you're empowering yourselves as you're reflecting, questioning, checking in, planning, whatever that is, because all of these relate to finding the right questions to ask when there are questions to ask.
I am not quite sure I know what you were asking.
Welcome to my world. It's what comes between my head that comes out of my mouth, and it may not. Mickey, did you get it, or I need to try and say it differently? Because we'll take your interpretation.
I would ask you to verify what you just said to validate.
And of course, now it's long enough. I have no idea what I said. It's about a skill. Okay, what do we lean into for ourselves when we are deciding, do we need to question more? Do we need to plan more? Do we have enough information to make a decision? Is there more to ask and consider before whatever has to come next comes next? So what's a skill you rely on in that when you're deciding, do I ask a question or not here?
I don't know if it's a skill, but Elizabeth, you want to take this one first?
No, go for it.
Okay. I don't know if it's a skill, but maybe it's a trait or a state of mind. I think that you have to be sort of, this is paradoxical thinking on my part, and I'll get to that in a second, but I think you have to be at least somewhat confident and sure that the thing you're working on is worth doing properly. And so if you have some sort of sense of worth tied up or what you're working on, then taking care of that, whether it's you or your project, whether it's a nonprofit or a business agenda, taking care of that business agenda, taking care of your nonprofit, taking care of yourself is the thing that sets me up to be able to ask questions and make sure I get what I need to do that job correctly. And I'm
I
hoping
think that was a skill.
Is that a skill?
I think so. I think it's something that we're leaning into. It's something we had to develop. So yeah.
Okay. I'm going to try to do the rest of this session without glasses because I'm tired of the glare from my computer screen messing things up for us. So,
all right. So
can't read these,
get really close. We
just don't ask me to read anything for the next 30 minutes. Good.
I will read anything to read. I'll read to you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Where are we at, Jess?
Well, I was going to invite Elizabeth to say, I was going to invite you to say something. And then I was like, well, maybe she'll go. I don't know.
Okay. Well, what I was thinking about is how to, what I try to do is leave myself reminders, like written reminders or reminders in my calendar, to check the places where I assume, because I'm really good at assuming things. Or as I said, empowering my team is also to remind them to challenge me. If I'm saying something that that is maybe sending me down a rabbit hole, or so in terms of empowering ourselves to ask questions, if questions in the moment, I try to remind myself that, yes, this is helpful. I need that information. In terms of questions around where do I go with my business, or how do I help this particular client who's got an issue that I have not personally faced, things like that, then I ask people who are experts about that. That's actually one of the joys of having a podcast, is that I can invite people onto the podcast who have experience that I don't have. So there are places, I'm also writing a book right now, and there's a chapter I think I need to include it, and it's something I really don't want to talk about. So I'm going to.
Good. I think that's it. You must include it.
Yeah, see, I have to include it. So I said, okay, this is where I'm going to be interviewing a whole bunch of podcast guests so I can get some points to say, okay, here's what you do in this kind of situation, instead of saying, well, that's not really my department, so go ask somebody else.
Right.
I need to be able to deliver that information to the people I'm helping, the people who are paying me to help them. So, yeah.
What you just said is all about accountability. I'll tell you what, Elizabeth, and that's one of the two skills that I lean into. Like I'm like, to your point about assumptions, to your point about worth, that both of those, they came up. Mine was accountability. And one of the ways that I can truly be accountable is when I'm willing to ask. If somebody's coming to me with a problem and I know I can fix it, my initial response is, well, let's just get it fixed, go this way. When in fact, a question to ask, because by the way, that's my ego. Ooh, I got this. Let's keep going. And I need to check that. And yet to be accountable, well, I have to go back all the way to the core values of our company, the way we do our business together. And then can I be vulnerable enough to pause? And by the way, I think this goes back to my context question. Is this the right context to ask, well, what would it take to make this great?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the next step forward to make change is? And I have two sources that helped me get that not lengthy and windy. And one is Cy Wakeman, because I'm reading her book, No Ego. And one is Max Erzak, who is going to also be on the podcast at some point in the future. And so that's something that I'm like, ooh, both of them said a variation of this. So I'm going to think about this. And I actually woke up this morning and went, oh, well, that's my question. I should be asking that every single time I want to be a little more vulnerable, and I want to bring in accountability, and I need time to process, and I want to see how somebody else is going to help us do this to deliver on the mission within our company or in our life or whatever. What can we do to make this great? And see what they say. It's the best way forward. We already have all of the constraints in place, and everybody knows what they are. Build on it.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's what I love is what you're saying about what would it take to make this great, is to slow down enough to ask that question. Because I'm like you, Jess. I want to go. It's like, okay, fix it. Yeah, that's why the word results is, my company is called Strategic Speaking for Results. It's like, okay, how do we get you there? You know where you want to go. Let's get you there. Boom, 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 go. And for me to be able to slow down and say, are there questions I haven't asked? Are there things I haven't thought of?
Right.
Yeah.
I was going to make a joke. I was going to say, isn't it weird that you can go out and commercially buy a number of chemicals that help you keep things up and awake and speedy, but if you want the ones that slow you down and relax you, you have to get a prescription.
Oh, wow.
Well, there are certain brownies.
Well said. Which I've, for the record, I've never experienced that, and I probably never will. So I don't know. Maybe I should talk to my GP about that and see what they have to say.
I live in Oregon half the year, and it's legal here. So, you can get CBD oil or whatever. But the one time I really wanted to do it was when we were in Amsterdam, and I didn't want to smoke anything, but people said, go to a cafe, eat a brownie, and then go to the Van Gogh Museum. And I thought, no, that haven't tried any of those substances since college. So, but that was the one time I was seriously tempted.
I love this conversation. This is why we live stream. You never know what you're going to get.
That's too funny.
It's legal here too, and it's all good. That's what I got to say about that. And so what I'm sensing from the two of you, and I know this is actually one of my core values, and so it's probably one of the reasons I sense so well around it, is curiosity and the willingness to try different things, do different things, show up different ways in an effort to be curious, because that's an open, willing place. Would you, what would you say about that?
I think you're not human if you're not curious. I think that being curious about the world around you is sort of an innate thing that you have to work hard to turn off. Or it has to be, pardon the phrase, it has to be beaten out of you. But that's just my knee-jerk opinion there.
Actually, here's another story. It reminds me of the many years that I worked as a stage director in the opera, and you never know what's going to motivate a performer. So I sort of thought of it as buckshot, where I would try an image, try it this way. What happens if we do this? What happens if we do that? What happens if we do this? Trying it different ways until you see the light go on in their eyes and they go, that one speaks to me. They wouldn't even say that. They would just go, now I understand what you're saying. And I would just say it in 15 different ways until they went, oh, okay, now I know what you want, and then go out and do it. So it was constantly asking questions. What if we do it this way? What if we do it that way? And that then is, been realizing recently how that translates into my coaching, where I will say, well, try this. That didn't work. Okay, let's try that. That one worked, but only partway. Okay, let's try that. You just keep trying things until you find something that works, especially if you're trying to convince somebody to listen, helping a client be heard within their company. They're trying to figure out what it is that's going to make the person who's not listening, what is it going to try with them? And you just have to try several things until you find the one that clicks.
And it'll change over time. That's
right.
the other thing. What worked for me when I was early on in my business worked for me then because of who I was, what I knew, and how I showed up. If I tried the exact same thing today, I'm sure I'd get by. It would not be as effective as it would be because I have learned so much.
I have a wonderful guest on my posit. He was a chief technical officer. And she said, I used to be one of the boys until I kept getting promoted, and then I wasn't at a certain level. I couldn't be one of the boys anymore. And suddenly they wanted to make me a senior director. And suddenly I was a girl, and that was a problem. And I had to relearn a whole new way of doing it. So she's now C-level.
Yeah.
But, you know, a woman who's a chief technical officer, that's a challenge.
Absolutely. There are not very many of those around. CIOs either. Which is, okay, so I needed to go back. You know, Mickey, when you were talking about you're not human if you're not curious, I went, what if you never changed the way you look? Like Casey Kasem when he was alive. It didn't matter when he was early in his career or late in his career. He basically looked the same and didn't look a day older in his life the entire time he was on air. And I think there are a couple of other people in our world that are still like that.
I have two thoughts in that regard. One of them is simply better living through chemistry. And
oh, is that it? I'm already naive there.
The other thought is
scalpels.
Right. The other thought is to quote the line out of Men in Black, which is to say, no, Elvis did not die. He simply went home. And so for any of our movie-going nerds who may be watching, yeah, Casey Kasem. But
I'm telling you, that was a little bit of a throwback. Was it Saturday night? Every Saturday night, he was on my radio growing up.
American Top 40 or whatever it was. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
not to derail our conversation too much, but somewhere out there, there's the recording of him having a rant. Like someone sent him this glurgy, heartbreaking, my dog just died message, and he just loses it. Like he's angry. And anyway,
wow.
Subject for another day. Yeah, I'm sure it's on the internet somewhere.
And you know what? If you need help finding it and you're really interested, whoever you are and Mickey can get together and then we'll get the answer. It'll be awesome. That's really great. Well, all right. So we're just over 30 minutes, which is about the time I like to have these happen. And we have some space. And so I would want to know, Mickey, Elizabeth, Mickey, what came up for you during our conversation that didn't really quite have a place to be said, yet should be said before we go?
After you, Elizabeth.
Oh, I'm just looking down at my notes because I've been writing notes here.
Me too.
Yeah. I think I'm basically okay with where we went. I can't remember anything that needed to be said. So, but I'd love to hear what questions Jess has, because Jess always has fabulous questions. So,
yeah. No, the only thing I thought that we maybe didn't cover was that, you know, the importance of self-esteem when it comes to asking questions. I have a suspicion that that's the thing that actually prevents a lot of people from simply being assertive enough to ask questions. And I use the word assertive. I think a lot of people confuse assertive and aggressive, and one of them is good and the other one's not so good. But yeah, I think self-esteem is sort of at the core of being able to suss that out and being assertive enough to ask the questions you need to get answered.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's interesting. I just want to call out, I said something that made no sense to either one of you, and you both had the courage to say, "What you talking about, lady? Please, please, please try again." And you know what? I wanted to call out that courage because I think that if we don't understand or we don't know, the initial result is to guess. And so that's where I'm coming from. When we're talking about growth, whether it's personal or as a team, when we're talking about how we want to show up in the world, when we want to talk about being like Nick, who just is kind of hanging around my feet, doing everything in his power to figure out how to get on camera. I think that that's one of those things where we really have to take a step back and go, if I don't ask a question, am I out of alignment with my values? If I do ask this question, does it matter how I'm perceived? And then both of those are great self-reflection questions to make small changes and then go for it because we're here. It's what it's about. It's about being bold, isn't it?
Well, and I would also say that if you ask a question and it's not the perfect question, use that as a way to open the conversation instead of, or if there's pushback it's just feedback. It's not necessarily personal. It doesn't mean you're wrong if you asked a question that sparked something different. Ask the question anyway.
That's
People
right.
And I also, people may push back for their own reasons or because they are defending their prize idea. And so it might just be a defense it might be their problem, not your problem. That's what I'm trying to say.
It frequently is, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm firmly convinced that our own insecurities are at the root of 99% of all the world's problems.
Right. Right. It's not the end of the world to say you don't know. That's another thing, You say, I don't know. I don't have an answer, but I can get you one.
Right.
Or I know who would know. But that takes self-esteem and courage.
That's right.
It's being bold.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, you are listening to a live stream of the Bold Business Podcast with Mickey Desai and Elizabeth Bachman. Thank you both for being here today. Make sure to visit reddirection.com where you can subscribe to our show on all the platforms that you could possibly want and maybe even a couple more. And I will say right now, don't forget to add your experiences. You're watching live. You're going to be listening later. All I can tell you is that join in the conversation. What do you want to do? How do you want to apply this? What have you seen in your experience? Because it's from all of our experiences that we get to learn and benefit and grow together. Nick concurs. All right. And
thank you, Jess. Love this show.
For being here. I am super excited to have had this time with you today. Until next time.
Thanks, Jess.